All right. Good morning. My name is Jim Rowland. I'm the Planning Procurement Bureau Chief here at the IPA. With me, I have a host of folks that are going to be presenting today. The second workshop in the IRP and the Resource Adequacy Mitigation Plan workshop series that we have. This is a continuation of conversations in a slightly different topic from Tuesday's workshop that we held. A few things as a point of order that Rochelle, who's going to be helping co-host here, is going to also go through. First and foremost, if you would be able to, if you haven't already, and I see many have, go into your participants and change your name to include the company or agency that you're representing. This will just help at the end when we have Q&A as well as we take stock. To do so, please click the participant button. It should pull up a list, and in that list, you should be able to find your name. And when you hover over it, there are three buttons. When you click that three button link, it should say rename, and you can easily add your name either in parentheses or in some other object. So that's the first thing. The second, as I had mentioned, is this is the second workshop this week, so I appreciate you rejoining. Still seeing folks filtering in here, so we're going to just take a minute to um, level set and also to read through some disclaimers so we can quickly get into the material. There's a lot to cover. So first, disclaimer, and bear with me, I'm going to kind of read through this. These slides and their contents are intended for informational and discussion purposes only and do not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policies by the ICC, IPA, or its staff. The contents presented, views and opinions expressed during the webinar do not represent a legal interpretation, statement of policy, or statement of fact by the ICC, IPA, or its staff. And the goal of these webinars is truly to inform and elicit participation from a variety of stakeholders, from all of you, as we begin to work through this IRP and resource adequacy mitigation plan process. So again, I thank you all for participating. I'm going to hand it over to Rochelle, who's going to walk us through a number of items before we get into the details. Rochelle.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. Hi, everyone. Rochelle Sampson with Veritas Consulting. I'll just go through a couple housekeeping items for this meeting. I know the first bullet says introduce yourself in the chat. In order to keep the chat clean and so we can make sure that we don't miss any questions that are in there, we'll go ahead and forego that portion. But just like what Jim was saying earlier, go to the participants list. If you could go into the participants list, find your name, it should be at the very top. Over on the right-hand side, there will be three dots to the right. And then if you click on that, and then it should have an option to rename. So just go ahead and include your name and your organization in your name up there. So that if you all could do that, that would help us with our Q&A at the very end. And also for this session, we do ask that you actively participate. We do have time set aside at the very end for Q&A. So if you do have a question or a comment about a particular slide, just make note of that, and then we'll keep all the questions to the very end or any of that feedback. And then when we do get to the Q&A session, we just ask that you use the raise hand feature in order for you to be called on. Once you're called on, then you can go ahead and unmute, ask your question or give your feedback, and then we can move on to the next person as well. And then also you can use the chat function, which will be monitored throughout the session, but we do ask that if you do ask any questions in the chat, ask them toward the very end so they don't get lost. And then again, we just want to make sure that everybody's respectful of everybody's viewpoints, stay concise, and just allow everyone a chance to participate. And then you'll also be asked to provide feedback on this session in a workshop comment form. A link will be provided at the end, and then that form will be live once this session ends as well. And then also, lastly, this session has been recorded and it will be posted on the IRP website. Next slide, please. I'll run through a quick overview of the agenda. So we'll start with characteristics of resources for capacity expansion modeling. We'll talk about supply side candidate resources, demand side candidate resources, and then after all of that is complete, we'll leave time at the end for Q&A and discussion. Next slide. And then most of you saw this slide on Tuesday, but for anybody that's new, we'll run through a quick overview of the timeline for all of these proposed stakeholder meetings for the IRP and the mitigation plan, all the way through the docket proceedings. So as you know, on the Tuesday session, we had our first stakeholder workshop that talked through scenario design. And then now in that orange box is where we're at now. So it's stakeholder workshop number 2, which we're talking about candidate resources. We do plan to have another stakeholder engagement workshop, technically TBD for now, but we'll talk through customer cost impact methodologies. And then in June, we'll have another one for ELCC results. And then potentially in August, September, we might have another public workshop for draft capacity expansion results as well. And then all the way on the far right-hand side are the ICC proceeding steps. So the IRP report will be released on November 15th. It'll be posted on the IPA, ICC, and IEPA websites per the statute. And then it will be submitted to the ICC, and then the proceedings will be initiated in November. So that's a high-level overview of our timeline for this process. All right, I'll hand it back over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Rochelle. So for those of you who joined us on Tuesday, this slide will be familiar to you, talking through the proposed scenario matrix. If you were not able to join on Tuesday, I highly encourage you to go back to the website. The recording of the workshop is up on the website, as well as all of the slides that accompany this slide. What I'm showing you right now is a summary of what we talked about on Tuesday. So if you weren't able to join, really encourage you to get further context for these scenarios as part of that slide deck. But as a reminder, we are proposing, I would say, sort of 3 broad categories of scenarios. We have put these out for your comment and feedback as well. And so please feel free to give us feedback through those stakeholder comments. Broadly, we're looking at 3 categories of scenarios. That first, core policy planning futures, we would consider to be kind of the base case. This assumes Illinois state policy as it is today, as well as kind of broader market conditions and market participation as it is today. And what really varies across those 3 sub scenarios within that category is the load forecast. Then we have a second category of scenarios called system evolutions futures. And these are scenarios where something about sort of the future has evolved and where we're seeing greater flexibility in the grid, maybe through higher energy efficiency participation, more demand response participation, and greater VPP potential. We're going to spend a lot of time in this workshop today, especially talking about that VPP piece. And my colleague Vignesh is going to talk through that towards the end, and we're really hoping to get a lot of feedback from you all on that piece. We are also proposing a scenario called the advanced technology acceleration scenario, where we assume that sort of emerging technologies are available sooner and at a lower cost. This is also a place where we're looking for stakeholder feedback. And lastly, that last category of scenarios is the alternative decarbonization paths. And here we are looking at different scenarios that all revolve around some element of CEJA deadline extensions, but also looking at alternative ways to achieve statewide decarbonization, whether that is through net zero or other pathways. Within that is also considering sort of RPS resource flexibility. As it is today, the model assumes that we must meet the statutory definitions between behind the meter, front of the meter solar, and wind. And those scenarios allow for the model to sort of choose between those categories in a more flexible way while still meeting the renewable portfolio standard targets. So just want to sort of level set. This is what we presented on Tuesday of the proposed scenarios. Okay, so for today's workshop, we are going to give an overview of our approach to candidate resources. The goal here is to kind of have some conceptual alignment and discussion around what will be included in our proposed approach. After this workshop, a candidate resource workbook is going to be uploaded to the IPA website. That's going to provide more detail around the cost assumptions that are displayed in this deck. Of course, what you will see in that workbook is that for mature technologies, those assumptions are better developed simply because we have more data points. For emerging technologies, we are seeking stakeholder feedback on input assumptions, especially in that accelerated case. You will also see that we are requesting input on the demand side resource side of this. We would love to hear what you all think about the framework we are proposing, as well as some targeted input from you all in terms of the parameters of how we model that. Upon reviewing stakeholder feedback, we will post updated candidate resource assumptions in time on the IPA website. Okay, with that, I'm going to get into sort of framing up why talking about candidate resources and those assumptions is really important for capacity expansion modeling, which is sort of the engine of the integrated resource plan. So I'm going to kind of tee up the conceptual overview of this before handing it to other colleagues to talk through supply side resources and demand side resources. So what is the question that we are trying to answer with capacity expansion models? The capacity expansion model is trying to answer what investment decisions should be made to meet long-term system needs at the lowest cost. And so we at E3, we are using Plexos LT to do this capacity expansion modeling for the integrated resource plan. And what Plexos does is it optimizes to identify what is the least cost portfolio of new resources to meet the reliability, energy, and decarbonization requirements specified in the model. And I think especially that sort of second piece around to meet the reliability, energy, and decarbonization requirements specified, that is where this connects to the scenarios that I just walked through, right? Each scenario is going to define the parameters that the Plexos model is solving for to create that least cost portfolio. So that's sort of where these two pieces meet. The model is seeking to minimize the net present value of the total system costs over the modeling horizon. And here we're talking about from 2027 to 2047. That is the modeling horizon for this IRP. And that optimization is including the capital investment and the fixed operating costs for new resources, because it's considering how much it costs to build new things. And it's also thinking about the variable costs for system operations for both existing and new resources. And we'll come into that a little bit more when we talked about the levelized fixed costs as part of the model. Now, it's not looking at that without also considering some other inputs that go into this. So our capacity expansion model is going to work in tandem with our loss of load probability model, which is called RECAP, to ensure that the portfolios that we solve for are reliable over a broad range of weather conditions. And the way that works is we start with that loss of load probability model, which calculates the effective load carrying capability, or the ELCC, of the different technologies that we are considering. And that ELCC, it measures how much those resources contribute to the reliability of the grid across hundreds of simulations. So here we are looking at dozens of weather years, running Monte Carlo simulations to try to create a broad range of weather conditions to test those resources as we arrive at those ELCC curves. Those ELCC curves are then an input to the Plexos model. And so the capacity expansion model optimizes for those future portfolios to meet those reliability and clean energy goals while minimizing costs. And then those portfolios are fed back into RECAP to assess and validate that we have met the resource adequacy requirements of the system. Those of you who joined us on Tuesday have seen this before, right? There are a lot of different data requirements that go into an IRP. And today we are focused on that yellow band of candidate resources, looking at a bunch of different components that feed into that candidate resource line item. And again, emphasizing that we're drawing on, a diverse set of data sources, but really trying to emphasize using public data sources. You will see sort of the data sources that we're drawing from in that cost workbook that's going to get posted. And as we ask for your feedback on the different assumptions we are using, we also encourage you to submit other data sources that you think we should consider as part of this. So at a high level, when we think about this candidate resource piece that we're going to talk about today, what we're talking about is what are the sort of component inputs that define each candidate resource, how that goes into the model, and then what the model sort of spits out on the other side. So on that first candidate resource inputs column on the left, for each candidate resource, we are considering that resource's cost, its contribution to reliability, how much it contributes to renewable portfolio standards, RPS, or clean energy standard goals for Illinois, and its operational characteristics. Then all of those inputs are fed into the model, and the model is trying to optimize for that least cost portfolio of resources. And it's doing that subject to meeting reliability targets, meeting RPS targets, making sure that we have enough supply, more than enough supply to meet demand, and build resource build limits, right? We can't assume that everything can be built today, or it takes time to build things, and the system operations. And all of that will then, on sort of the output side, we will see subject to each scenario's definition of those sort of blue boxes, the resources that are needed to meet those goals. And so this is how these pieces flow together to, at the end, for each of the scenarios we study, we will see kind of what that portfolio of resources looks like, and that will inform state agencies in terms of what steps they want to take with that information. And so the last slide before I'm going to hand this over to Nate to talk about supply side resources is talking about how we levelize costs across different resources. So here we want to talk about that the levelized fixed cost is an important sort of piece that goes into the model, right? So this is looking at the levelized revenue required in each year to cover all of the fixed costs of that resource. And here, this is important because this is how we are able to compare apples to apples, different resources and how much they cost and how they need to recover that revenue over the lifetime of that resource. Then we also have, and we are including in this presentation and in the cost book that will get posted, the levelized cost of electricity. And here, the levelized cost of electricity considers both those fixed costs and the variable costs as part of that component. Now, we provide this because this is a useful reference point, but we want to be clear that this is not an input to the model. And it's not an input to the model because to calculate that and put that in the spreadsheet for you all includes an assumption about resource operations, right? It assumes how often that resource runs. But we will be, the model, the capacity expansion model, will use those levelized fixed costs with also the model's sort of determination of dispatch, of how it's dispatching different resources. And that dispatch accounts for those variable costs associated with that resource. And so we just want to emphasize here that the levelized cost of electricity that we are presenting here is meant as kind of a point of reference for you all as you consider this information, but it is not a model input, whereas all of those different component parts that go into levelized fixed cost, that is an input to the model. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Nate to talk about supply side resources.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hi, everyone. For those of you just joining us fresh for this Friday and missed the earlier workshop, welcome. And hello again for everyone who was just with us a couple days ago. So I'll be talking through our principal assumptions and conceptual approach and framework to modeling supply side resources. So utility scale, front of meter, generation, and storage resources for the model. Charlotte, let's go to the next slide here. And we'll get right into it. So principally, we can think about the candidate resources that the model will be allowed to select from to choose its optimal, cost-optimal portfolios to meet the different requirements in each scenario according to mature technologies and emerging technologies. So mature technologies, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the next couple of slides, represent resources that have proven commercial operations at a wide scale and are typically available resources with more well understood characteristics. Now, this does not mean that certain operating parameters are not uncertain or variable in practice. This just means these are technologies that have a long operating history. So that includes solar PV and lithium-ion batteries, onshore wind, natural gas combustion turbines in both simple cycle and combined cycle. So CT being your simple cycle combustion turbine, your combined cycle gas turbine is your CCGT, and nuclear, specifically Generation 3 pressurized water reactors or light water reactors, as we'll refer to them categorically. Emerging technologies, on the other hand, would be advanced nuclear and long duration storage. These are technologies that do not have long operating histories, have not yet been deployed at scale, and in some cases do not even have kind of initial demonstration or pilot projects that have been operating to sort of demonstrate the technology's actual operating characteristics and costs. So principally, when we think about advanced nuclear, there are a lot of different nuclear technologies out there. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. And this is going to represent a range of really small modular reactor technologies. Long duration storage, we are going to be modeling a multi-day storage resource. Also, there are a range of technologies that can provide this characteristic of a multi-day energy storage, and that's how we're going to be characterizing this resource. Each of these resources on the mature technologies and the emerging technologies, in order to be modeled, needs to have a number of characteristics attached to it, assumptions around how much it costs and what it does. So those assumptions are the capital costs, which is the upfront investment to build the resource, the financing costs, the debt and equity, so that's the cost of capital over time, and fixed and variable operations and maintenance costs, or O&M. Also, these technologies need to have a commercial operations date, which is the earliest date for the model. We'll talk about this in a couple of slides, that the resource is available for selection to come online from the model's perspective. There also needs to be a maximum resource deployment potential in megawatts by year and over the entire model horizon. Um, that is, you can think about this as how many megawatts can be built of a resource of this type reasonably in a given year and in a given model zone, as well as how many megawatts could theoretically or really feasibly be built in total in a particular region, right? We also need to model for certain resources, namely gas combustion resources, the heat rate and the emissions intensity, the output profile for renewable generators. That's going to be an hourly profile, which will tie to a capacity factor or an annual expected generation profile and output based on a specific weather year condition. And then we also will have these eligibility, requirements for is this a renewable portfolio standard eligible resource to meet the state's renewable goals? Is it a clean energy standard or zero GHG eligible resource to meet the state's clean energy goals? And so on. So with that, we're going to be then talking for the next few slides around our assumptions for these specific technologies. So let's start by talking about the time horizon here, right? So the objective of the mitigation plan and the integrated resource plan model exercise is to look at a 20-year projection period under different conditions and to evaluate different resource portfolios that are, best fit, at least cost, meeting the different criteria needs of the state of Illinois over that entire horizon. So that means we need to consider these different stages of time that resources are available across mature and emerging technologies and by resource type. So let's talk about the near term first, and then we'll talk about the medium and the long term. So by near term, we're talking about between now, summer of 2026, 2027 really is the first model year through 2030. Why have we defined the period this way? Well, 2030 is going to be the first year that the capacity expansion model is allowed to choose new resources to come online in the model. And that's going to be because the earlier years, between now and 2029, the resources from a supply side perspective, utility scale resources that are going to be added to Illinois and to the broader regional grids of MISO and PJM are going to be resources that are already in progress, right? All of these resources have a development, interconnection, and construction timeline. So it's not reasonable to expect that if a resource is not already in this some stage of development, that you can snap your fingers and have that resource appear online tomorrow in the model year. So we're not going to let the model do that. Instead, we're just going to be reflecting resources that are already in development, that are already in advanced stage pre-construction or actually in construction already. Those will be modeled just as exogenous, in other words, independent inputs to the model that are assumed to come online. The model's not going to select those. 2030 is the first year the model will get to select additional resources beyond those planned additions, as we'll characterize them. Those additional resources also are going to be constrained by resources that are in the interconnection queue, but are not yet contracted or under construction. We don't want to double count resource availability that could be added in this time period. Once we get out to 2031 to 2040 in this medium term, this is where we are in a window of time from a development and construction timeline that projects that could begin development after the IRP and any subsequent procurement decisions are approved in, say, sometime in 2027, perhaps at the earliest, those resources could feasibly start development and come online by 2031, 2032, and beyond. Now, different technologies will have specific different start years here. So not all of them, but that's the general concept. This means that the resources that will be available, and we'll talk about them shortly, in this time horizon are going to be limited or constrained based on development timelines from the IRP approval period to first commercial operations. So, and then in the long term, we want to look at, why are we distinguishing medium term from long term? This is really where commercially ready emerging technologies are going to be assumed to be available based on our best data available for model selection. Okay. So this is where mature technologies will continue to be available over this horizon. 2047 is going to be the last model year for the study. So that's the final year of a resource portfolio that we're doing, and that's going to be a 2027 to 2047 inclusive modeling period. So the next slide is going to be, let's talk about what constitutes an emerging technology and commercial readiness. Okay. So there's a lot of content here. This is really meant to be a conceptual approach and framing slide. And because the emerging technologies that we're focusing on for this study are really nuclear and long duration storage, that's really the principal lens that we're evaluating, these specific technologies, right? So, for that perspective, let's talk about what commercial readiness really looks like and means, right? So, for a technology that has, not been deployed at scale, and at scale, I mean, not megawatts, but gigawatts, and not 100 operating hours, but thousands of operating hours by that technology. That's kind of what we mean by at scale. We can think about it from a couple different stages of development, right? In a very early stage, it's a concept, it's some academic studies, it's maybe this thing could work, right? Then there's a prototype stage. Now that stage could be many, 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 many years. At some point, there needs to be an initial prototype where there is some demonstration that the math works, the engineering concepts work, that the actual technology works, right? And that prototype is still quite a long way from commercial readiness because that's just, one test reactor, so to speak, right? Then we have to have a demonstration stage where there is kind of a more full size system that is operating under real world conditions, quote, in the field. Okay. And this is where usually a lot of government support funding to get projects through the R&D pipeline to this stage of development, additional private capital. This takes a long time to get up to the demonstration stage. Then between demonstration and early adoption or mature stages, we're talking about the difference between having one test reactor, one test power plant that's 10 megawatts or something at one site to multiple operating commercial facilities that have fully been, under commercial arrangements in real world conditions. And by multiple, obviously this is a scale up and specifically for new technologies that have, as yet unproven or not yet built out supply chains. This is also where we have cost learning and deployment scale challenges. You have, individual workforce training. You need to have construction, labor that can understand how to build this technology again and again and again, right? So this is really a key kind of learning curve element. In the technology literature. And the way in which we're going to be characterizing these emerging technologies in our model here is that our base case technology scenario, right, where long duration storage and nuclear technologies are candidate resources, the model can select them, are really going to be focused on this early adoption, mature scale, which really only Generation 3 nuclear is in right now. Also noting, though, that generation, like these Gen 3 nuclear reactors, which have many thousands of operating hours commercially in the US and around the world, there is also still a gap and a disconnect between how easy they are to build and how long they take to build because the United States has not built any Gen 3 reactors outside of the Vogtle 3 and 4 plants in Georgia recently. And so we are going to be, looking very carefully at that. Long duration energy storage, on the other hand, there's a range of technology companies and there's a range of deployment of those technologies. None of them are at a wide scale of commercial deployment. So this is where we sort of categorize them in the stage 7 to 8 or demonstration stage, and that informs our timeline expectations as well. So that's the conceptual concept, around how we're thinking about the what is commercial readiness, right? And why are we thinking about this? And then we'll move on to talk about some specifics. The objective of an integrated resource plan, right, is to inform state policymakers and all stakeholders in Illinois as to different realistic and feasible pathways under a number of scenarios for the state to meet its long-term energy goals, right? So it wouldn't be a very useful study to make really optimistic assumptions about a bunch of technologies and then say, well, the answer is this brand new technology that's never been operating that is now deployed immediately everywhere and is super cheap, right? That wouldn't be a useful planning result. And neither would it be a useful planning result to say these things that are in development are never going to happen, right? So really something in the middle that is trying to test under different conditions of commercial readiness and cost where the place of these different technologies are in the mix alongside, understood known quantities like combustion turbines, solar, wind, and battery storage at this point. So let's go to the next slide here and we'll get into it a bit further. I want to go one more slide and we're going to come back to this one because in order to talk about timelines for nuclear, let's talk about how we're considering modeling different nuclear technologies. All right. So we have three proposed categories of nuclear technologies that we propose. We have uprates at existing facilities. So these would be existing nuclear plants in Illinois that could make certain improvements to equipment, which would allow those plants to generate incrementally more energy and capacity. Then we have new large-scale nuclear reactors. So these would be characterized as your Generation 3 pressurized water reactors, your light water reactors, which would be represented by the AP1000 reactor, has a unit size of around 1,100 megawatts. And then we have a third category of new small modular reactors, which is intended to encompass a range of emerging nuclear technologies, all of which have very different specific operating characteristics, but also can be, I think, fairly represented um, with some common performance characteristics and a common or representative range of capital and operating costs. Each of these reactors, namely, is very different in how the grid would perceive its operations because you can build a few hundred megawatts at a time rather than committing to a gigawatt or more at a time. But these will be assumed to not be available in the same time frame as the Generation 3 reactors. So let's now go back one slide and we'll talk about how we are considering the range of commercial operations dates for these technologies in the model. All right. So first, I just want to reiterate again that the period from 2026 to 2029, and 2026, as we're building the model now, and it is 2026, we are going to be building off of the resource adequacy study model because that model already needed to represent existing resources, which are online today. So we're just going to be updating those existing resources from 2020 six assumed versus 2026 actual, what has come online, what's an advanced stage, what's coming online this year, and having that be our new refreshed starting point. Then we're going to be adding those resources in the next few years, which are already at advanced stages of development. And those are going to be added exogenously, as I said. So then from 2030 onwards, we are going to allow the model to select additional onshore wind and solar PV utility scale projects, as well as short duration lithium ion battery storage. Short duration here, we're characterizing as 4 and 8 hour lithium ion batteries. Then after, and those are the technologies that we're letting the model choose, by 2030. We will be reflecting certain technologies that are in, say, the RRI or the ERAS queues in MISO and PJM, not as a model selection. So there are new gas plants that are expected to come online over the next couple of years that are in those queues. They were in the RA study, but they are a planned addition. They're a project that's already happening. The model doesn't have to choose those projects, okay? So we are going to be reflecting those projects. So, new gas combustion beyond what is already in planned development. The first online date is proposed here to be 2032. We could talk a lot more about this. Gas turbines are in short supply right now across the United States, across all markets. And the cost of new gas turbines has gone up dramatically. So, gas turbines availability is going to be a key constraint to how fast a brand new gas plant can come online, in addition to the interconnection and development and construction timeline attached to that kind of project. Now, we don't see like solar module availability as a similar constraint for solar, but solar is still constrained by the interconnection development and construction timelines, right? Same with wind and other resources. So that's why gas is reflected here. Now, I just want to say that we'll round out gas, then we'll talk about LDES and nuclear. So the gas COD range, we're going to be using 2032, proposing through possibly the end of the model, 2047, for gas. Now, this is representative gas. So we're going to talk about the difference between in-state versus out-of-state gas in just a moment. All right. And yes, lots of questions about FEOC and stuff coming in. We will talk about all of that. Nuclear, we have these three categories of nuclear, not just because they are different in their megawatt size and their likely cost, and their unit size, but when and how fast they think they can come on. So nuclear uprates generally can come online earlier in the total horizon. They don't require as much development work as a brand new nuclear facility. So a Gen 3 nuclear facility, we are proposing to have the earliest date, the model can choose it, to be 2037, which represents 10 years from 2027, when we would anticipate perhaps, the first possible, real push to develop any new reactor as a result of the IRP, right? This is not saying that that's what is going to come out of the IRP. This is just saying that the earliest kind of reasonable time frame that we are considering for this new nuclear reactor is going to be 10 years. And we feel that's pretty well benchmarked by data. And I would say, if anything, that's a tad optimistic. Advanced nuclear reactors, the SMRs, SMRs, broadly speaking, are not deployed even at pilot scale in many of these cases. There are a couple reactors that are kind of in progress, but that is a far cry from you can go out there and sign an RFP or put out an RFP and sign a contract with a new SMR and have it online through its entire development process, including licensing. So advanced nuclear reactors, we propose to be first available for the model in 2045, right? And that's based on an expectation that, maybe some of these first demonstration facilities, if they do stay on schedule and we'll be continuing to get information from the industry on this over the coming months, may start operations in the year 2030s, but then you have that's starting operations. You have no operating history, you have no additional scale up, you have nothing else that is supporting the, reasonable expectation that these things can be deployed at scale materially, for anyone. And so that's why 2045, kind of 10 to 15 years after the first first of a kind or FOAK facilities would be operating. An alternative case, our advanced technology case, you can see the hash bars, is going to assume that advanced nuclear may be available maybe as soon as 2040, right? Instead of 2045, a more optimistic assumption. So long duration energy storage, similarly, um, by and large, there are not operating facilities for a lot of these technologies, right? And some of them have some operating facilities, but they're not, hundreds of megawatts, right? Those are maybe in construction or like in development of some stage. They're tens of megawatts. So again, this is the difference in deployment scale, right? And so that's what we're trying to reflect here in the first availability. And also, we have to look at what's in progress from an interconnection and development perspective and adding some construction time to that to make 2037 in the base case a sort of reasonable estimate for when long duration storage could be deployed at scale under our base case technology assumption. So I know there's a lot there, and we're going to keep on coming through the deck, and I know there's going to be a lot of questions here. So let's talk about combustion resources. So let's talk about gas, all right? I want to differentiate here between existing gas combustion, in other words, in state. This is an Illinois planning exercise, so we're talking about gas in state, right? So existing combustion versus new combustion. Existing combustion in state in our core policy planning scenario, as we discussed, we are going to reflect the CEJA emissions limit driven retirement schedule for in-state resources. Now, in-state fossil generators, coal, oil, and gas. I just want to say this is meant to be combustion, so we are talking about coal, oil, and gas in this top left bar. Um, the earlier of the CEJA emissions date or an owner announced retirement date is going to be reflected in our base case for Illinois generators. Under an alternative scenario, which is, for example, our CEJA extension scenario, which we are analyzing for the mitigation plan, we will be assessing an extension of the operating life beyond the CEJA schedule. All right. For new combustion generation, this is principally going to be new gas. We are not proposing to model new coal or oil generating units. So this is principally new gas combustion. So let's talk about first in state and out of state. So out of state, new across all of our scenarios, we are going to allow the model to select out of state new gas combustion for Illinois. Now, the reliability value of that out of state gas combustion is going to be capped at the import limits into Illinois zones, right? That out-of-state gas that the model can select is going to be allowed to run for its entire useful life. It's out of state. It's not subject to CEJA and does not need to be shut down by 2045. Now, in-state is then going to be differentiated by scenarios. So on the left-hand side for our core planning scenario, our in-state gas generation, we are going to say under the core policy case that new plants must retire by January 1st, 2045. That is per the CEJA emissions, limits. New plants, if they are built at all in the model, will need to be have their costs fully recovered by January 1st, 2045, meaning that the effective cost of that new plant in state, if it's selected, the model would have to see that cost be sort of fully burdened by that plant within a very compressed period. The model may or may not decide to select new gas under this condition, but that is how we're going to model it to reflect existing law and policy under CEJA. We are in this IRP and mitigation plan proposing not to model the availability of low carbon fuels like renewable natural gas and hydrogen combustion at scale. So there's not going to be a continuation of the assumption that maybe hydrogen is available at some cost per MMBTU in state in the post 2045 period. Also important, drawing from our discussion earlier this week, we are not going to model a limit on the emissions from imported power to Illinois. CEJA does not have a limit on imported emissions power, so we're not going to model that. An alternative decarbonization scenario, we are going to allow new gas generation to be built in Illinois without limits on its generation or operating life. And the investment costs will be allowed to be recovered over the full economic life of a gas plant, which is 30 years. Gas plants can run for longer, but we use 30 years oftentimes as a reasonable life limit for those plants. We are not going to model low carbon fuels being available in this alternative scenario. However, that new gas generation in this alternative net zero scenario is going to be subject to the net zero goal. So that new in-state gas generation, just like imported gas generation, both of those megawatt hours are going to need to be offset by Illinois contracted or built GHG-free electricity exports from Illinois. And that together is how we're going to consider this alternative decarbonization path of net zero. So let's go on to the next piece of the puzzle here. And now let's just look at our initial proposed costs for these various resources. So we are building off of the same cost estimation framework and modeling that we have used for the resource adequacy study. And in doing so, these represent sort of refreshed views of costs. The capital costs are generally drawn and anchored to the annual technology baseline from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, now called the National Laboratory of the Rockies, NLR. And this is the latest baseline, which is from 2024 vintaged. We have also since checked and compared this baseline with a lot of market data and market benchmarks. So these are the cost trajectories. On the left, we have the capital cost. This is the overnight capital cost in nominal dollars per kilowatt nameplate. This is per kilowatt AC for your renewable systems. On the right-hand side, we have the equivalent LCOE or levelized cost of electricity in nominal dollars per megawatt hour. We are assuming a flat 2% per year inflation projection over this time horizon. It's a long-term model, so we want to make a long-term inflation expectation, and that underpins these costs. What we can see here is that in general, the levelized cost of electricity, and really that's calculated. The model will be seeing the capital costs and fixed operations and maintenance. All right. And then the LCOE is designed to just be a more helpful reference point for you all to digest what these costs actually mean when you go through the math of levelization and cost of capital and tax credits and everything else. We are going to be assuming that wind and solar, basically, we're assuming current law regarding tax credits and foreign entity of concern restrictions and everything else that the current administration and Congress have passed from the July 2025 budget reconciliation bill. So what that means here is that the last year that wind and solar projects would reach commercial operations and be able to recognize and keep the tax credit of production tax credit or ITC will be 2030. Beyond 2030, 2031 and onwards, there will be no tax credits assumed for wind and solar in the base case because that is current policy. That will apply to those resources, but we're also reflecting current policy for other resources, and specifically nuclear, so small modular reactors, SMR, and light water reactors, LWR here, reflects our capital cost and then effective LCOE, assuming a pretty high capacity factor, I think 93% here. So we can see that as the tax credits roll off under current policy, and we're assuming a 4-year safe harbor for all resources, we can see that the tax credit roll off has a significant upward impact on the cost of those resources. So we're going to go from in somewhere around $150 at the first online dates for those resources to higher than 150, more like 175, $200 a megawatt hour. Let's go to the next slide and we'll then talk through our cost assumptions. On this slide, we have our gas combustion resources and our lithium ion batteries and our generic long duration energy storage resource, which is modeled here as a 100-hour or multi-day long duration resource. So the capital cost assumptions on the left-hand side here are just, again, dollars per kilowatt overnight capital cost. You can see that we are expecting the elevated cost of new combustion turbines and combined cycles, CCs, to remain high over the forecast horizon at current levels, and then with some slight increases over time as we expect the global supply-demand balance for turbines to remain tight in the horizon in this base case. Lithium-ion batteries, we can see decline somewhat in capital cost, but not dramatically in nominal terms over the forecast in our projection. And we can see a slight increase, or really constant real cost for the generic LDES resource over this horizon. Now, when you look at that inclusive of the storage investment tax credits and a levelized fixed cost, which is your, dollar per kilowatt year, here it's expressed in nominal dollars per megawatt day, we can see again that the expiration of the tax credits does have a material impact on the effective cost of these storage technologies. There is not an equivalent impact because gas turbines are not eligible for these tax credits. So this reflects our proposed and cost assumptions for these various technologies. These cost assumptions, I want to note for everyone, are being uploaded today in an Excel form. So you don't just have to squint at the charts. You can use the numbers in the Excel. And we will be inviting comments from all of you on these specific costs over the coming weeks before they are fully finalized in the modeling. At this point, that's going to wrap our initial presentation. I saw many questions pop up, so I look forward to engaging in those shortly. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Vignesh, and he is going to talk through our modeling approach for demand-side resources.
Thanks, Nate. While you're on camera, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me well.
Yeah, you're good. Go.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. So in this section, we will discuss our approach to modeling demand-side resources. Next slide, please. Let's start with aligning on terminology. We define energy efficiency, EE, as a reduction in demand with better appliances or measures such as better windows and insulation, which gives ratepayers the same service that they need with lower power consumption. Demand response is a more active response in response to the energy price being really high or a dispatch notification being received from the utility or the system operator. When it's a plain reduction in demand, we might call it shed demand response. And when the reduction in demand in 1 hour leads to an increase in load in another hour to compensate for it, it's called shift demand response. Then we have distributed energy resources, or DERs. This is a broad term for customer-sited resources, which may include small-scale solar on rooftops, on canopies, or ground-mounted in nature, behind-the-meter storage, quote-unquote, demand response, backup generators running on a given fuel. And then we have virtual power plants, a terminology we will use very frequently in this presentation. VPPs are defined as an aggregation of distributed energy resources that, when combined, can provide the same utility scale and grade service like a traditional power plant. We acknowledge that there's no single universally accepted definition for these terms, but this is the IRP's interpretation to ensure that we're on the same page as we use these terms over the course of this study. Next slide, please. So VPPs are defined as an aggregation of distributed energy resources, and this slide is just a simple illustration of that. If we focus on the left figure, a system may have multiple types of DER building blocks in the form of managed EV charging opportunities, behind-the-meter solar and storage, residential and commercial appliances, other types of demand response. So these are what we're calling DER building blocks. And these building blocks can be packaged in different ways to form a VPP program. That's the figure on the right here. So the same building blocks can be used in different ways, in different proportions to create a VPP program. And as you can imagine, even if these building blocks add up to the same nameplate capacity in megawatts, the type of response, the cost of the program, and the benefits to the grid could be very different based on what the composition of the VPP program looks like. Next slide, please. Let's spend a minute on the foundation we built for VPP evaluation in the resource adequacy study and the renewable energy access plan completed last year. And then we'll discuss how the 2026 IRP and mitigation plan will build on that foundation. The figure on the right here shows the evolution of the statewide nameplate capacity by resource type in a near-term year, then 2035, then 2045 in three different scenarios. This figure is from the draft REAP submitted in 2025, but the same assumptions, scenarios, results can also be found in the resource adequacy study report. And I would like to direct your attention to the red highlighted box on the right, which highlights demand response, lithium-ion batteries, and distributed solar. So the studies we completed in 2025 with the state agencies, it already included existing demand response program. It included distributed solar growth, consistent with the state's long-term RPS goals. And the model also optimized the total volume of storage that could be cost optimal. It did not explicitly say where the storage could be sited, but in practice, some of the storage could be closer to generation, some of this could be customer sited, and some could be somewhere in between. And all of these resources were both added in the model and dispatched optimally, accounting for the need of the system, but also how these resources interact with each other and with the rest of the portfolio to bring maximal benefit to the system. Simply put, while we did not, the term VPP was not used in these studies, these resource types were shown as their own slice. In effect, a VPP was modeled. And so that foundation was already built last year, and this year we're going to take it one step ahead. We still plan to model these existing demand response resources, lithium-ion batteries, and distributed solar, alongside other resources Nate talked about. But in addition, on the demand side, this year we will, for the 2026 IRP and the mitigation plan, we will also model an additional VPP resource, which we'll talk about in future slides. We will also take care to ensure that we are avoiding any double counting of resources. To take one illustrative example, if some amount of distributed solar is assumed to be part of a VPP, then it would be wrong to also give it a certain ELCC on a standalone basis and show that as a different slice, because the same resource cannot exist twice on the system, right? Either it's a standalone resource or it's part of a VPP and being dispatched with it. And so we'll be sure to ensure that we're not double counting resource contributions. And this is a concept that we will double click on later in this deck. Next slide, please. All right. So this slide is just meant to briefly talk about how we will model demand side resources in different scenarios. So 10 scenarios were proposed in the workshop we held on Tuesday. Across all of these scenarios, we'll make some baseline assumptions for demand side resources. That's the second row here highlighted in gray. All scenarios will include distributed solar growth consistent with the state's RPS targets and long-term plan. They will also include energy efficiency measures embedded within the latest utility load forecast that will be used. They will also all reflect existing demand response programs in the state. And finally, any new VPPs assumed in response to the VPP tariffs that Surge requires to be proposed will also be included. Additionally, in two scenarios, which are the high flexible future and the high flexible high load future, we will also model a higher energy efficiency trajectory, and we will model a representative flexible load resource to reflect the value of additional VPPs. Next slide, please. Let's first talk about the baseline assumptions that will be consistent across all scenarios. The Clean and Reliable Grid Affordability Act, or SURGA, required Ameren and ComEd to file tariff proposals by June 1, 2026 to develop a VPP program that leverages customer-side resources and to develop demand-side flexibility programs for different types of resources. Given the timeline of the IRP, we will make assumptions for the participation in these tariffs and programs, and their impacts will ultimately be reflected in our resource adequacy and our capacity expansion models in all scenarios. Effectively, participation in these VPP programs will reduce the need of the system and the need for supply side resources. Next slide, please. So those were the baseline assumptions. That was an initial take on the baseline assumptions we'll make across all scenarios. Now I would like to take a couple of minutes to walk you through what incremental modeling of VPP in our two quote unquote high flexible scenarios will look like. The process starts with us collecting data starting today, and you can play a role. So the first step here is to collect data on different VPP program archetypes. So we'll be looking for stakeholder input on what types of DER building blocks should be considered as part of a VPP program, the cost assumptions associated with that, the operational characteristics and limitations, etc. All of this data will help us get a sense for what a single representative VPP archetype to model could look like. Then in step two, this information is collected, analyzed to then define a single representative VPP, which will comprise of some DER building blocks. In defining this VPP, we will also be defining the megawatts or gigawatts of combined potential that could be assumed for this VPP archetype. Then in step three, this representative VPP resource will be fed into our resource adequacy model, which will dispatch this resource in interaction and conjunction with other resources on the portfolio to provide maximal benefit to the system. The effective capacity or effective load carrying capability for this VPP will be modeled, which will then be fed into step four, where our capacity expansion model comes into play. The same representative VPP would also be modeled in the capacity expansion model along with its ELCC, which will effectively reduce the need for supply side resources. And our plan is to conduct runs in these two scenarios with and without the representative VPP. And when we look at the difference in the results, it will give us a sense of the reduction in supply side resource needs and the cost associated with them, which is essentially the savings that could result from introducing the VPP. Those savings can then be qualitatively compared to the cost of these VPPs, contingent on stakeholder input, to perform an initial benefit cost assessment. This overall approach does introduces the opportunity for us to directly model VPPs in a capacity expansion framework to help the model directly see the benefit that VPPs can bring to the system and reduce supply side resource need accordingly. Given the data limitations and time constraints in this IRP cycle, our vision is to model one single representative VPP informed by stakeholder input, but the same foundation can in future cycles be expanded to consider additional VPP archetypes. Next slide, please. Let's double click on the types of information that stakeholders can provide and will be extremely helpful in designing this representative VPP to be modeled in this RP cycle. One, we would love to know what the VPP program should comprise of. So any information that can be provided in terms of which types of DER building blocks are more important to consider than the others, and in what proportion will be very helpful. Two, we would like to know what amount of load reduction or net output to the grid can be possible with this VPP archetype. So information on participation and enrollment assumptions, megawatts as available by program and region, how that megawatt availability may change based on time of day, month, or season will be helpful. Thirdly, this VPP archetype will need to be defined with duration and frequency assumptions. We'll want to tell the model how long can a particular response be sustained for, and how frequently can the program, the resources behind it, can be called upon. So information such as, on a given day, how many hours can this program be called upon? If there's any minimum rest time requirements between two events, the number of times a program can be called upon in a given month or a given season, a given year will be helpful. And finally, the cost information for this VPP archetype will be beneficial in performing an initial benefit cost assessment. So any information stakeholders can provide on both the administrative cost of setting up and running a VPP program and the participant incentive cost will be beneficial in that regard. Next slide, please. Painting a picture for what outputs may be expected from this IRP and the mitigation plan. The framework we are proposing here allows us to both account for the reliability contributions and benefits of VPPs by directly modeling them in our resource adequacy and capacity expansion models. Additionally, because this is a 20-year study, it also gives us a sense of how the needs of the system may evolve, and as a result, how VPP programs may need to evolve to continue providing most benefit to the system. So starting with the left hand of this slide here, um, modeling VPPs in our resource adequacy model will give us a sense of how this VPP is dispatching in coordination and collaboration with other resources. And all of that will be reflected in the effective load carrying capability that we will calculate and report out. And as I noted, because this is a 20-year long, the study horizon here is 20 years long, we will also be able to capture how the value of this VPP may change as the system's needs change. So, for example, if we are currently in a summer peaking system with relatively low solar penetration, then the highest loss of load risk periods may exist for a few hours on hot summer afternoons. As the solar penetration increases in the future, the net peak may shift into the evening and become longer in duration. And this is where, for example, things like storage and managed loads of different types can add value to the system. In the very long term, once solar penetration is extremely high and electrification of heating also takes place, the system may become winter peaking and the critical periods may shift into the winter on days where load is considerably high and renewable generation is relatively low over long stretches of time. So as the system's needs evolve, it will naturally lead to the definition of the critical period and the ELCC of resources changing as well, which we will be able to report in this IRP, which can then inform future VPP program design. And finally, on this, with this figure on the left, on the right here, modeling VPPs directly in our capacity expansion framework will allow us to report what the resource portfolio could look like with and without a VPP. And the difference in them, which is basically the supply side resource capacity, will give us a sense of how many less megawatts of supply side resources may be needed and what are the savings associated with that VPP. And those savings can then again be compared to the cost provided by stakeholders to perform an initial benefit cost assessment. Next slide, please. Beyond the 2026 IRP, this modeling framework and outputs can help the state continue to make progress towards identifying a cost optimal portfolio and tighten the coupling between system planning and program design. So a little more specifically, this modeling framework and the outputs from the 2026 IRP and the mitigation plan can enable formal avoided cost studies to evaluate the benefits and costs of very specific demand side resources. Additionally, the structure, as I noted, is being used to evaluate one single representative VPP this year, given data and time limitations. But once that structure, that framework has been set up, it can be expanded to evaluate multiple archetypes in the future. And additionally, because this is a long-term study, we will be reporting out how the needs of the system evolves over time as a result of load growing, as a result of the resource portfolio changing. And that is information that can inform VPP design in the future to bring most benefit to the system. But modeling is only as good as the assumptions that we make. And so stakeholder input on VPP cost and parameter specifics is extremely crucial, both in this current cycle, but also in future cycles. On that note, I'll pass the mic to Rochelle, who will tell you how you can plug in.
Perfect. Thanks, Vignesh. Awesome. So now we'll talk through stakeholder feedback, and then we'll get into our Q&A session. As we stated before, there will be a comment form. The comment form can be accessed via this QR code on the bottom right, or the link in the PDF document of this presentation. So you can either use either one, and that will not be available until after the session is completed. And then you can also send any questions that you have. You can also submit those via email as well. And then we'll go into next slide, please. And so now we'll go into our Q&A session. So we'll answer questions live first, and then we'll get into our chat, our very lively chat. So we'll answer any questions live for anybody that wants to raise their hand. Go ahead and use that raise hand feature, ask your question, provide feedback, and or any comments that you have. And then we'll just call on you in the order that we see that your hand is raised. And then after that, we will move on to the chat questions as well.
And
So
one other item as we're queuing up with questions that are coming in, there are a slew of questions that came in through chat. What I'd encourage all of you to also consider is we're going to have a written feedback section. So some of these may actually be best expanded upon through that written feedback, those questions that we have posted and that you can respond to through the form, because you can provide additional data and information, your recommendations, which is really what we're trying to solicit through this process. So we'll do our best to go through and answer and review the questions that are in chat. Some may be better through a separate section. And you may actually want to provide more information through written format as opposed to verbally here, because it could just be difficult to go through it in a verbal setting. So we appreciate all the questions. We're going to do our best to go through them in the time that we have. But no, this isn't your only chance to ask the question and to respond to your thoughts and ideas, because we have that form.
Thanks, Jim. First hand I see Philip Golden, IIEC.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Hey, Jim. Nice to see you again. Can we go back to slides 11 and 12 real quick? So I got questions on those two, and they're the cost slides. And the first question really is on slide 11, where you say you're gonna use the levelized fixed cost, which includes all the O&M, et cetera. Maybe I put it. No, go that one. There you go. Thank you. Sorry, it's 13. I wrote the wrong number down. I apologize. But aren't fixed O&M costs and other costs, especially for something like a battery, determined by dispatch? So how do you include levelized fixed cost but exclude dispatching and still come up with what's a reasonable cost estimate in terms of determining affordability? I just That makes sense to me.
No, great question. Let me answer this briefly. This goes to model methodology, right?
Right.
So what the model's doing is the model's actually simulating dispatch conditions, right? So it is doing system operations and taking variable O&M into account, including battery charge and discharge, the effect on prices, marginal price formation by transmission zone, all of that stuff. That sample is then feeding into its variable cost estimation over multiple years. And then the levelized fixed cost is what it costs to build stuff, right, over time. The model's taking both into account. If we wanted to pre-feed the model the LCOE, then we would be circumventing the model's own dispatch as that changes from different portfolios being selected. So that's why we don't force feed that into the model. We're going to put in the operating conditions and characteristics of each resource, including heat rates and fuel prices and all of that for existing and new resources, like for gas combustion. And the model is going to take that into account in its optimization. So that's why levelized fixed costs are the input by each resource. That would be the non-variable, non-dispatch oriented cost of the system, which is build and annual O&M.
Okay. That's helpful. That makes a little more sense, because I thought that was a comparison metric and made no sense to me.
Yeah,
Can we go
no,
back?
fair question.
Can we go back to slide 12, which has the three boxes, one of which is the, you know, yep, this one. I want to focus on the Plexus LT model, this middle box. You've got minimized cost subject to, and then you've got one, two, three, four, five different categories ranked there. Or is how are you going to rank order those? Because they, if I put reliability target is number one, that's going to produce a different outcome than if I put supply versus supply greater than demand is number one, which is going to come out with different resource build limits. I mean, how do we rank order these? And then the second part of my question is, why is minimized cost subject to these instead of the alternative that these should be subject to minimized costs?
Yeah, certainly. I'll answer this briefly. There's a lot more we could say about this. This is how capacity expansion models work. So it's a linear optimization function. So the objective function is to minimize total system cost over the entire model period. Each of these is modeled as a constraint, which I know can be kind of technical jargon for optimization modeling. It's a very common framework for these models to work. So in other words, each of these is not actually rank ordered. All of them must be met in any given portfolio solution.
And so none of them would have a greater weight than any other. So, for instance, if I have one that gives me a reserve margin, I'm just going to pick on reliability targets because that's something that I think a lot of people are easy to understand. A reserve margin of 15%, that's going to have the same weighting as a model that produces a reserve margin of only 12%.
I'm going to answer this slightly differently. I'm going to say each of these constraints as modeled must be met for a solution to be found in that scenario. Not all of them are binding constraints in every year. In other words, you might have a situation where one policy objective or one reliability objective requires building a bunch of stuff. That means you have more than you need in some other criteria, right? Based on how you've
Gotcha.
defined it. So they're not
Okay.
always binding in every scenario, but they are always required to be met.
And then, okay, I got you. And then let me come back and then I'm going to yield because I want other people to have an opportunity as well. Help me understand why this is minimized cost subject to these versus, why shouldn't minimal cost, and maybe you said this and I missed it. Why is it minimal cost kind of like the initial filter that, if option A is higher than option B and all these are met, you go with option A. Because
Yeah,
that's not the way this reads to me at least.
Understood. Yeah, this is we'll maybe follow up on this. This is how linear optimization models are structured and how they work. So the subject to it is part, if you kind of look up out there how linear optimization models are defined, there's an objective function, which is the thing that you keep testing the outcome. It's like the what you do is basically you're testing many different portfolios that each meet all the other criteria that are here, and then you're choosing the one that has the lowest cost that still meets all the others. So it's an iterative model function where each of them is a linearized parameter and you're trying to optimize across everything. So each set of like results is going to be the cost minimized version that still meets all the other requirements that you fed to that scenario.
Okay, I'm gonna have to sit there and chew on that for a little bit. Thank you. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Yep, sure.
Thanks, Philip. All right, we'll move on to Scott Dunbar, Council to Joint Solar Parties.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks for this presentation and the one on Tuesday. They've both been extremely helpful. I had two questions, if that's all right. The first is, I was wondering how you plan to model community solar and if that is included in the model, either as a assumption and as a selectable resource, such that increased levels of community solar could be used to meet load growth.
Yeah, great question. For the short answer, just given time here, is we are not modeling distributed energy resources as selectable resources for the cost optimization. So community solar will be in the model, just as it was in the RA study. It will follow an assumed trajectory based on the policy goals and the policy proportions in the base policies case. One of the policy cases will be allowed to choose community solar or more utility scale solar or wind instead over time. But generally, we were going to be modeling community solar along with the rooftop residential solar systems as an exogenous, non-model cost optimized input that is going to follow current policy preferences and proportions and targets over time.
Okay. The second question is related to that first one. So, one of the potential outcomes of the IRP process is that the IPA's long-term procurement plan will be adjusted potentially. So the IPA could decide to procure more distributed solar through the long-term plan as a potential result. So is that modeled as a potential outcome? Like if there's value to doing that, wouldn't it make sense for the model to have the option to select to have that happen as a way to meet need in the future?
Yeah, so we're going to be considering the different scenarios in the recommendations very holistically in terms of recommendations to the agencies.
Right.
If
Okay.
I'll just be straight with you, Scott. If you were to show the model, the effective cost of construction operations of a residential solar unit for its output versus a utility scale unit, the utility scale one is a lot cheaper. The model will not choose that one. So it is the policy to support that has a lot of policy reasons around it that are not easily reflected in the capacity expansion model, which is why we're modeling it as an exogenous trajectory. But we will be considering in the emissions and costs and benefits and all kinds of holistic analysis, the different portfolios that come out of this for ultimate recommendations.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Scott. And before we get to the other couple live questions, we'll go ahead. I just wanted to make sure for the live questions, we just want to make sure that everybody's just asking one question, and then we'll get back in the queue so you can ask a second question. But I'm going to flip it over to Nate just for some of the chat questions, since I know there were a bunch that came through. So before we get to Jason and Scott, we'll go through some of the chat questions. We get those answered, and then we'll go back to the live questions.
Sounds good. Rochelle, do you want to just, for everyone's sake, just kind of read me the question and we'll go from there? I just want to get through as many as I can.
Yeah, sure. One of these, I don't know, Scott, this might be a couple of the ones that you had. Scott was asking about what's the granularity in Plexos modeling, substation feeders. Will granular data be released for stakeholder public review? And how will least cost and loss of load probability be balanced?
Great question. Could talk for many hours about this, but the short version is the granularity in the capacity expansion model, which selects resources by zone. In other words, what is a zone? A zone is a REAP zone within Illinois and is a transmission zone outside of Illinois. The model also has the zone of MISO Ameren Zone 4 and the ComEd PJM zone for the sake of reliability requirements. So we are trying to meet a target reliability need at that transmission zone level in accordance with the capacity market constructs of MISO and PJM. Loss of load probability modeling, including reliability of each different portfolio and the effective contributions to reliability, or ELCCs, of individual resources, will be modeled separately in a loss of load probability model called RECAP. And that model is already in progress and being done. And it was the same model used for the resource adequacy study.
Perfect. Thanks, Nate. Next one, Michael Hoadley from Fusion.biz. How is the model handicapping new wind deliverability under current federal policy?
The model is not going to handicap that. We are going to consider that in how we allow the model to choose how many megawatts get built and over what time period. So we understand and very much appreciate that current federal policy is not very supportive of new wind resources. There's also local community pushback to a lot of siting for new wind. Some of that is going to be taken up into the actual wind projects in the queue. So when we constrain the model in the very near term years to only select projects that are not yet built or signed but are in the queue, that is the potential space of projects that the model could reasonably select. Over time, we're going to relax that assumption because this administration will not last forever, and we need to take a long-term view that wind resources have a certain technical potential and a certain cost trajectory in the broader, longer arc.
Next one was from Jason Masters from G Corp. I'd like to ask about how you model the increasing weather volatility as it creates differing electrical demands, and will the model include enhanced geothermal and other deep rock geo?
Okay, we'll try to hit those with a 1-2 punch. Those are very different questions combined.
Sorry.
So second one first, we're not modeling enhanced geo in this IRP. Definitely an interesting resource to consider for the future. But again, to my earlier framing point, we need to model a technology that has some reasonable likelihood of coming online with a reasonable certainty around cost and performance. And that I do not think we can point to in Illinois and say that fits those criteria in terms of advanced stage development that we can pull in under that framework. Second question, or rather the first part of that question then. is going to be model weather variability. So we are covering this in the reliability contribution of each resource by modeling hundreds and hundreds of weather years based on a 40-year, simulated data that shapes load and renewable generation in tandem to understand a lot of different weather conditions, including those recently experienced in Illinois from winter storms as well as summer heat waves. So all of those will be characterized and included in the reliability modeling and reliability value of each resource.
Scott Bernstein again from Just Resilience. So do you include shorter term storage as mature, since you define long duration storage as multi-day for the near term, now 2030 period? Should the market evolution and Illinois mitigation planning determine additional need to avoid rolling blackouts? How will potential deployment of additional demand reduction measures be specified? And your tech readiness scale lens example, such as advanced nuclear and multi-day storage, is biased toward a smaller number of large interventions. What about a strategy of a larger number of smaller interventions using mature technologies?
Okay, so we'll start from the top here. So first, yes, short term, short duration, i.e., 8 hours and less of lithium ion reference technology battery storage is absolutely a mature commercial technology. It is still in the early stage of its total operating engine hours or operating life hours, but we're talking about somewhere on the order of 30 to 40 gigawatts have been deployed in the US alone, like in the last 5 years. It is definitely a mature and understood technology from a financing and commercial operations perspective, even though refinements continue to be made and chemistries continue to also evolve. So short answer, yes. Multi-day, similarly, is not at a 30 to 40 gigawatts of deployment when you take out pumped hydro, which is very site specific, and Illinois is very flat. So that's not a really realistic candidate for Illinois. Um, can you remind me of the next questions, and we'll just take them one by one, Rochelle?
Yeah, let me see. Your tech readiness scale lens examples is biased toward a smaller number of large interventions. What about a
Yeah,
strategy of
let's
a larger? Go ahead.
Okay, got it. I'm actually I want to kind of move past this. I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at here. We're going to be considering a whole bunch of different options in the scenarios that we have put together, and a lot of different portfolios, and what's common across the portfolios, and what's different across the portfolios to understand a range of possible futures. I wouldn't say that we are going to be biased towards like a single couple of large interventions. We are talking about what we know, what we know we don't know, and what we don't know we don't know. And that's where we're trying to frame everything in terms of high uncertainty, high impact, and getting good envelopes of outcomes.
Raj Rajan, SOO Green HVDC link. Another longer one. How will your resource modeling handle imported resources from other RTOs that are grid tied and not connected to specific generators? They don't show up under supply side as shown, as they do not fit into individual buckets such as solar, battery, wind, gas, and nuclear. And then it says, isn't an injection point like an HVDC converter station in Illinois a source agnostic supply side resource? And then assuming timing of in-state or imported new gas and modeling will take into account the lead time for procuring gas turbines, currently at least 6 years.
Yes, so the lead time to procure new gas turbines is in part why we have 2032 as the first new generic gas-fired combustion resource that is available to the model for selection. Regarding transmission, transmission is important. Transmission allows power to flow from one location to another. It does not create that power itself. So it is not a generator resource. It is, you're right, it is part of the model topology, right? You need to model the transmission as a potential constraint on how generation can flow from one place to another place in the model, mainly to meet reliability as well as sort of the economics of how price formation works and congestion, all that good stuff. So the short version is we are not modeling generic transmission with no generator attached as a generation resource because it's not a generation resource. And transmission is not inherently clean or dirty. It's just a highway, right? It's a pipe. It's an ability to flow power from one location to another. So if we either include a transmission line with a specific generation attached to it, then that is considered as it is. If we do not include transmission with a specific, or if there's no specific generation attached to it, then we have to model the generation mix and the operations of that other zone where the transmission's coming from. And so generally, the way we're talking about transmission here is the transmission will be will be modeled in terms of what can flow on an hourly level between Illinois zones and non-Illinois zones. And we're modeling the resource mix and how that changes within Illinois and outside of Illinois. The reliability of, like, say, a new transmission upgrade to import more power into Illinois, we are going to make the model see that as requiring additional generation on the other end of a specific kind in order to actually understand the incremental reliability benefit of that generation, because the reality is both RTOs over their forecast horizon, as evidenced by the RA study, are expected to be short on generation capacity. In other words, you can't rely on existing megawatts out there when that entire regional zone needs to build new megawatts in order to meet its own needs.
Chelsea from Energy Futures Group, how will you determine the amount of nuclear uprate capacity that is possible? And just wanted to confirm if the uprates will be optimized in Plexos.
Great question. Some of those uprates, like very near term, there are some uprates in progress now that will be modeled just in as planned additions to the model, because the model doesn't have to select them. They're happening already. These are some small megawatts that we understand are already in the RRI queue for PJM. We are going to need to get information from the owner constellation of existing nuclear plants in Illinois to understand those uprates. We can't sort of look in from the outside and do an engineering analysis of their plans to understand what could be done and do our own cost estimation that is outside, far beyond the scope of our data and study. So we will need to rely on information provided by the plant owner, with as much sort of independent benchmarking of that information, especially cost, as possible. And that will lead to a specific kind of amount of megawatts that could be added from uprates with some cost attached to it for the model selection.
All right, grab some other questions here. Aaron Grossi, there are already existing models of virtual power plants in the market today. In Europe, Next Kraftwerk is one of the biggest VPP operators of managing closed loop systems for distribution service operators. Energy Hub has emerged in the US as a prominent brand envisioning and managing VPP platforms. Which VPP model is IPA considering and learning from in making these recommendations? And do you expect the utilities to procure their own VPP platforms and aggregator capabilities?
It's a great question. We, in the sake of the IRP planning, are trying to understand the value of VPPs in a big category of they could individually be comprised of many different kinds of things, right? There could be some distributed batteries, some demand response, some smart thermostats. All of that could be aggregated and dispatched under a platform, as you say. We are not trying to choose what platform is going to be used here or assumed, because actually, from the model's perspective, from understanding the value to the grid, the value to the changing resource needs of Illinois, it's not very important. Not to say it's not important, it's just not important for that consideration, right? What I mean specifically is what matters, and this goes to another question I saw in the chat around like VPPs being as a demand reduction or supply side resource. You can't count it as both, right? Either you're reducing demand in a certain hour or you are generating output, like actual energy from something like a battery in that same hour. They have a very similar net effect in terms of what the other resources in the grid have to do, right? But you can't count it as both. It's either one or it's the other. So the way in which we're proposing to model VPPs in a representative way that is still analytically robust and helpful for decision making alongside, say, bulk grid resources, right, is what is the performance characteristic that is important to capture that could reasonably be achieved by one or more different portfolios of actual specific resources. And those characteristics can actually be boiled down to a few key ones. A shed or reduction in load over some sequential number of hours, right? And a shift, whereas that load that's reduced actually has to be made up for in previous or subsequent hours, right? Which looks a lot more like a battery from the grid's perspective. So understanding those performance characteristics and the total kind of quantity and trajectory of quantity of the megawatts that could have those performance characteristics is the most impactful input to the model. And then another question that we have, hopefully we'll preempt this one. Um, by modeling a mix of rest of grid resources with and without that assumed trajectory of load flexibility, it gives us a very good indication and understanding of the value of that flexible resource. What's really hard to understand, right, is the actual bottom-up cost of having that resource perform as function, right? And that needs additional work, and we do not have time for that in this study. We're going to get as best information we can around the performance characteristics, right, and the trajectory potential. But by modeling the difference of the with and without case, it is a useful counterfactual because it very clearly indicates what you would have to buy and build to replace that demand flexibility if you didn't have it. And that sets a pretty reasonable avoided cost type benchmark for the value of that resource. Not the cost of doing it, but the value of that.
Perfect. Thanks, Nate. I saw a couple other questions about VPPs. I hope that answered those questions. Next one we had was Chris Townsend, CJT Energy Law LLC. Where in the model will the self-direct renewable portfolio standard participants be incorporated?
We are going to, yeah, I think we'll come back to that. I don't want to take a lot of time. It's an important question. All of the specific renewable portfolio policies and standards as they apply to different customer classes are going to be represented, within the model framework of what resources need to get built and what resources are being built under those specific programs.
Perfect. All right. From Zhanghan Quan, what's the temporal and spatial resolution of your models, both Plexos and CEP model? How do you capture the values of LDES?
Yeah, so we have a loss of load probability model, which is determining the ELCCs of resources, right? That model is simulating, the range of resource dispatch conditions over many, simulations, so hundreds of simulations of different hours and weather years of all the hours. Um, the Plexos model itself will be running an optimization over a 20-year horizon with sample dispatch throughout each of those years to inform its selection. So long duration storage, like any other resource, will be informed by its expected fixed costs, right, to build, right? That's the levelized fixed cost. And it's going to be reflected in the contribution to the reliability requirement, its ELCC, as well as through the dispatch modeling, the effective, energy arbitrage value that that resource would have that would be netted off of the gross cost. And the model would see that it gives this much ELCC value at this much net cost, net of variable costs. And how does that compare to other resources in a very similar apples to apples framework?
Perfect.
One quick item here, just to kind of interject. I know there's a number of questions here in chat from Raj, from Nicole on transmission related recommendations and requests. If Vignesh, if you or Charlotte could jump on and just kind of answer them, because there's a different process for that than what we're going through here, and I want to make sure we address that.
Yeah, happy to do that. So, one thing I want to clarify is that the focus of this workshop is candidate resources that should be allowed within state boundaries. And that is why we're focusing on these resources. But to be very, very clear, we are modeling all of PJM and MISO's LRGs 1 through 7. The topology is available in the RA study report, but also as per the Renewable Energy Access Plan. So want to be very clear that the focus of this presentation is what resources should be allowed to be selected from within state boundaries, but we are modeling the entire RTOs. And so imports and exports will be accounted for, and transmission has a role to play there. And then with transmission specifics in terms of local transmission upgrades versus inter-regional projects, etc. I'd like to direct folks to the Renewable Energy Access Plan process and study. I'll drop a link in the chat after I'm done talking. But as part of that project, we will be in a very detailed fashion evaluating local transmission upgrades and interregional projects, including proposals from stakeholders to emerging transmission constraints. And there are tie-ins between that study and this one, but that's the right platform to discuss those details. I'll drop a link in the chat box. If you have transmission to talk about, please engage in that process. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Vignesh. All right, I think we got most of the questions. I know Jason Smullen from Rolandberger, I know you had some questions in here, but I also see your hand is up. So if you wanted to, we can ask those questions live, but I don't think, did I miss any questions in the chat? I don't think I got most of them. Okay, perfect. All right, we'll move back to live questions. Thanks, Nate, for going through that. Jason, if you wanted to, from Rolandberger, if you wanted to ask your questions live, please feel free.
Yeah, two questions, and thanks again to the agencies and the whole team. Recognize all the hard work that goes into this. First question is probably easy. Just curious, with the capital costs and the useful life, do some of these resources have like overbuild or mid-life cycle refreshes included in the CapEx?
Yeah, great question. We it's different for lithium-ion batteries than it is for, say, wind and solar, right? Where wind and solar, we are representing that, you're going to do turbine replacement, you're going to do panel replacements on those resources over time. That's going to be rolled into the fixed operations and maintenance costs that are reflected for like per year, of those resources sort of parametrically.
Yep.
For battery storage, the degradation of the batteries themselves and the augmentation costs are going to be reflected really through an augmentation cost. So in other words, an additional cost that is part of the annual O&M to effectively maintain the battery's rated capacity. Now, we understand that we do a lot of work in batteries, E3 does, that some folks in some markets are letting the batteries degrade and making a sort of value-based decision of whether they should overbuild today and then let them degrade or something like that. Um, all of that is really important commercially and in reality. So I don't want to downplay that, right? We've done a lot of this work, but from the sake of like the role of batteries relative to other resources in the big picture of do you need 10 gigawatts of storage or 3 gigawatts of storage, it's not going to move the needle dramatically. So what we do is we make a simplifying assumption for the model that the battery operating SOC capability, state of charge capability, megawatts and megawatt hours are maintained for the model's sort of operational dispatch decisions of the battery value. And then we're assuming that that augmentation cost is included on the O&M side.
Very clear, helpful, and we see similar things, so very much appreciate the simplification. The others related to batteries as well, it seems, at least at the read, you're kind of equivocating or tying together closely PFE compliance and domestic content. And would just like to better understand kind of the characterization there, because if you assume everybody's PFE compliant to get the 30%, and then everybody's domestic content compliant to get the 40%. We could source a Korean cell and not meet domestic content, but satisfy PFE. So just curious a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a short and a medium term compliance to this. So once the tax credits roll off, it's a bit of a different, animal because you're no longer dealing with that. While we have the tax credits, which will be an important model period, we have done a bunch of additional, sort of analysis to look at the tariffs of, different countries, what countries are producing different things, the percentage of the capital costs of lithium-ion batteries that are from imported components subject to tariffs. And what everyone is doing now is that optimization math, right? And we don't have the ability to do this for every possible combination of supply chain, but we're trying to do a representative, kind of aggregate estimate here, where functionally you have the option of using more expensive domestic content, right? To meet that and blend it with foreign content, and the foreign content has a tariff and the domestic stuff doesn't, but the domestic stuff is more expensive. And you also want to get the blend of FEOC so that, or rather foreign content, so you can capture the tax credit during the tax credit eligibility period. And so you're really looking at the sort of optimization of, is it better to just not do the tax credit and take cheaper foreign stuff, but it's marked up and it is what it is? Or does it make more sense? And we generally, it makes more sense for a lot of things to do that mix and match where you're taking domestic content and foreign stuff, you're taking the tariff on the foreign stuff, and you're still taking the ITC, for the battery. And that kind of blended net effect is sort of a reasonable expectation. We could talk a lot more about this, of course, it's pretty complicated, but
Yeah,
we are
of
trying to
course.
reflect kind of the general supply chain and commercial realities that we observe in the market.
Helpful. Thank you.
Thanks all. All right, we have about 10 minutes. I want to make sure we get through the rest of the questions. So if you do have a question that's pressing, I would just prioritize your question as far as you, as much as you can. So we'll go in order. Scott from Just Resilience. Go ahead and unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Hi. Thanks. This question may be for IPA, but you might want to take it also, Nate. You referred, Nate, a few minutes ago to things that are events that are unexpected or perhaps that we can't control. I mean, severe weather, the actual availability of importable energy from other regions. That I'd add the actual rate of technology readiness and all of this. And what triggered this sort of hybrid workshop was a discussion a few meetings ago where it was announced that a mitigation plan is called for based on your resource adequacy study. I think your line was, we cannot rule out the likelihood of rolling blackouts between now and 2030, or words to that effect. So this characterization that sometimes in your slides you called short-term and sometimes baseline assumptions, and from there everything else is what are we going to do from 2030 on? The question it has to do with whether the mitigation plan includes options for readiness in the very short term, in this now to 2030 sort of period. So, Jim, maybe that's you. I don't know, but I would like to hear something about that. And I think it's reasonable to ask the question, how is Illinois doing anything additional? Since we have found that there is this non-zero risk that we might have to be prepared for. I should add, I do a lot of work in New Jersey where the same question is being asked, and they're counting on exactly the same import resources that we are. So it's I don't think it's an unreasonable question, but everything that Nate you framed was about how the IRP process. You're doing diligence on that on those assumptions from 2030 on. I get it. It's a good plan. So for IPA, what is Illinois doing to make sure we possibly could take other kinds of actions with criteria that go beyond the ones that were listed by Nate at the beginning of this presentation? Thank you.
I definitely want to give Jim the opportunity to respond to this. Jim, do you mind if I take like 60 seconds or less, just initial framing here?
Sure, take it.
Okay. Um, I think it's a very good question, and I do want to be very clear about just the realities that we all live in today, right? Which is that Illinois, even if Illinois had a whole bunch of additional megawatts just magically tomorrow, because Illinois is interconnected very highly to these regional markets, those megawatts are going to be dispatched in accordance to all the megawatts in the entire region. In other words, if PJM is still short, it doesn't matter how long Illinois is on capacity. Illinois is part of the same market. ComEd faces the reliability risks through the interconnected transmission network of the entire region. Same with MISO. So you can't dodge that bullet being part of these large interconnected grids, right? The power that could exist in Illinois, even if it were magically online tomorrow, could be pulled out to send to other places to try to maintain the total reliability of the broader system. And that is a very real reality that's important to note, right? And it is a challenge of these regional markets because your neighbors affect you and you affect your neighbors. So that is also part and parcel of the broader context that we are very, very aware of in the framing of this planning exercise, the consideration of the near term, and the consideration of what Illinois can and should do about this nested challenge between its own state goals and needs and the region's goals and needs. Jim?
Well said, Nate. And what I would also say is if you kind of, many of you were participating likely in the January workshop we had. So the first thing I also want to address is the time period doesn't just start in 2030. It's really 2027 and forward, which is where we get the 20-year IRP span of 2027 to 2047. There are only certain things that we can do, but I don't want to put the cart before the horse. That's the purpose of the process for the mitigation plan, and also recognizing what the mitigation plan is trying to do in relation to the IRP. The mitigation is very specific in what it's asking us to do, looking at all things, but really focusing on the emissions targets that we have for a state in consideration of how a delay or alteration of them for a short period of time could support this. The IRP does that and more. And so it's really a combination of these two that we're looking at what the solution set could be in the short, the mid, and the long term, and also recognizing that there are certain limitations inherent, like Nate said, in the short term. So there's only so much maybe we can do. Just from an IPA perspective, you look at the plans that we have. We're going out for energy storage very soon here, 3 gigawatts, but the first is for a little over 1 gigawatt with operation beginning roughly around 2030 or sometime around there. So there are certain things that we as a state are already doing, irrespective of what the mitigation, the IRP are going to recommend at the end of this process. So I'd say that that's really the point, is we're trying to figure out what we can do, what's the risk, and what's the opportunity, and then trying to provide recommendations given what actually occurs. So also much of this is forecast. There could be instantly, as soon as we put out a report, a change in, say, interconnection for large load customers. There could be a change in recommendations for resources. There's any number of things that could happen, and so the idea is to come up with, in my words, a playbook and looking at what those solution sets could be. So it's a great question. That's really the point of why we're here. But I'd also emphasize that while the mitigation plan looks at the short term, it's really also in combination with the IRP to the mid and long, looking for that best supply mix to really support all of the scenarios, all of the risks and opportunities that we have, and then achieve them that way.
Jim, can I just ask one quick clarification? So you believe there's no barrier on the part of utilities required to submit IRPs to submitting very short-term contingency measures to deal with unexpected levels of demand. In other words, that they're not turning this in, as I understand it, until November 15th, and then there's a process after that that you have to go through. In terms of 2027 and 2028 readiness for any potential disasters here, um, what have you, you expect that there's room within those IRPs for utilities to present contingency plans or not?
I guess I'm going to say I'm not hypothesizing anyway. There could be broader RTO considerations that are made. There are many pressures beyond just what's in Illinois specifically that we have to take into consideration. But it's actually it's a broader scale here. Even looking at capacity markets for PJM, I'll pick on them for 10 seconds. We know that many of the short-term constraints and the challenges that we're seeing aren't actually within Illinois specifically. It's a different region. It's a market solution that's trying to be identified and solved for. So I think just in the broader consideration, there could be. We're going to do our best for what we have in the time that we have to evaluate them and consider in the short term. But there may be things that are going to be occurring outside of the IRP process or are already in process. VPP measures, procurements, like I already mentioned that the IPA is doing, that we'll see what happens in combination with where the forecasted load is going to actually go and the demand on the system that occurs.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott. Okay. Andrew from ComEd. We have a few minutes left.
Yep. Thanks for the time over the last really this week. Quick question, I hope, is I am interpreting from all of this that the ELCC will actually be an output of the modeling as opposed to an input. Obviously, I think both MISO and PJM have kind of technology specific ELCCs, but it sounds like we're going to kind of let the model dictate what that is, and then kind of, notwithstanding whatever their markets value them at, we'll let the model determine their value.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, but I'll expound on that for 60 seconds because I think it's a very important point. So we will be modeling ELCCs dynamically or endogenously within the total modeling framework. We have to do that really because ELCCs fundamentally depend upon the nature of the resource portfolios that exist and the nature of the conditions that the grid is subject to in a range of expectations, right? Different weather years and conditions, and how much you build. If you have a lot more renewables, then each marginal renewable or storage has a very different DLCC, right? So we have to take that into account. And so we will be. We are certainly building our modeling framework for the loss of load model and how we calculate ELCCs and how we link them to each other in the range of different conditions. That is very aligned both conceptually and like well benchmarked to the values that the RTOs are releasing. There's some more sort of details, devil in the details there, that can be talked about as this is a complex topic. But the short version is we will be considering and anchoring to the RTO's official methodologies, but then allowing our model to forecast changes dynamically in different portfolios over time.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, we have one last question. We have a couple minutes left. Philip, IIEC.
All right. Hey, Nate, I'm not trying to pick on you, but I am. I want to go back to something you said when you were talking about transmission. You said it's not a generation resource, so we're not going to model it. It doesn't generate anything.
We are
Why
modeling
wouldn't
it,
that?
just to be clear. But carry on.
Okay. Wait, I thought you said that the gentleman who was asking about the transmission that it wasn't being modeled as an input.
Finish your question and we'll get to
Well,
it.
okay, so my question is this: if you're saying transmission doesn't generate, then and so it doesn't get included, and maybe I misheard, batteries don't generate, so I'm trying to square those two things. If you're not a generator, like transmission inputs or injection points are not, and batteries are not, why are those two being treated differently?
Great question. Um, Cognizant of time, I can't spend a half hour right now talking about that, but it's a good question. So in short, right? um, they do operate pretty differently, right? So batteries really are a load modifying resource, right? Or
Fair,
ultimately you can think of them as a generation modifying resource because what they do is they consume power through round trip efficiency losses in order
sure,
to take energy that is available to be generated in some time and move it to a different time. That's what batteries do. All batteries, right?
sure,
So that's how we're modeling batteries. Okay, just in the short version is that's how we're modeling them. Now, what transmission does is it doesn't allow for power to be moved over time. It allows for power to be moved over place, right? Location. And so that's how we're modeling transmission. And the two are actually quite different from a reliability perspective, right? And from an economic, so dispatch perspective, where in the same exact time of a given hour with loads and resource capabilities, transmission allows power from one location to actually serve needs in another location. Or consequently, if there isn't enough transmission, then is a difference in the availability of generation in different locations. Whereas storage allows a different time of generation availability to be captured and taken and used at a different time. So it's a very different concept for how that impacts reliability. And so we are treating both resources in accordance with what they do, is the short version. I think what we were talking about before from these specific transmission companies is they have very specific transmission projects that they connect one location to another location. And
right,
that does or does not have a specific generation resource that is new and incremental attached to it. If transmission does not have a generation resource attached to it, I'm not saying transmission is not important or useful, but what it does from the sake of the model, right, is you then have to understand, okay, well, what transmission and loads are over here and which ones are over here, and does changing the availability to flow power from here to here what does it do for you, right? That's the whole key for transmission. And we are reflecting the value of transmission from that perspective and from is that impactful for the reliability needs of stuff over here? Because, for example, one example, if
right,
there is no power over here that's available during that time, it doesn't matter how big the transmission line is. You still are short on power in that same hour, right?
right. So then the follow up has to be from that. Are you also going to model batteries as resolving transmission constraints? Because that's what if I understood you correctly, that last little part you were just talking about was essentially transmission constraints impacting reliability, and were batteries going to be modeled as transmission constraint resolution
Yep.
opportunities or
Yeah.
not?
So we're not going to be explicitly modeling them as transmission constraint alleviation. Batteries can do that, but the ability of batteries to do that is quite dependent on a number of granular factors, right? Because again, batteries can move stuff over time and transmission can move stuff over place. The two can intersect when a battery, like when a transmission constraint is binding because in a certain time you want to move more power from A to B than you can. If a battery could actually charge at the same line limit earlier and then alleviate that constraint by, releasing that power at that time, then it could relieve some of that transmission constraint, but it really depends upon the nature of the constraint between time and place.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the answer.
Perfect. Thanks, all. I don't see any other hands raised or any comments in the chat, so I will pass it back to Jim to close us out.
Great. Thanks, Rochelle. And thanks, Nate, for Handling the gauntlet of questions here. So as we wrap up, first I want to thank everyone for participating in the process. A couple things for next steps. So first, if you haven't noticed already, we have posted the recording for the Tuesday session. It's up and ready. Secondly, this session's recording will be posted probably first thing Monday. It takes a little time to render the full recording, so it'll probably be posted on Monday. There's also a few other things. We are updating the slide deck that we have posted. It may already be done now. I sent it to my comms team. If not, it'll be done at some point today. There's also the additional data set that I believe Charlotte mentioned at the very start of the workshop. Again, that'll be posted at almost the same time if it's not up there already. I don't have it up on my screen. Um, both of those will be available today. I'd say go out and pull those down if you want to look at them now. Last and not least, as you saw within the slide deck itself, there's the question set. So I'd say go out and look at that, begin to review and update that, provide your dated information. We really need that dated information to help inform our process. Conversations here were exceptional, and we want the supported information so that we can consider it as part of our evaluation process. So please take a look at what we've posted, look at the data sets, look at the questions, respond to those, and help support the process. If you have any other questions as we go, please let us know. Reach out to us, either myself or you can do so with Joy at the ICC. We'll be happy to put you in connection with whomever we need to or connect with you separately. And otherwise, I hope you all have a great Friday and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.